Well, there have been two offers made this afternoon, one by the Prime Minister.
All right, which do you prefer?
Well, the Liberal Democrat MPs will meet tomorrow and they'll consider all of
But
these
didn't
matters.
you like the
And
noises that David Cameron was making? He was using words like being involved. I mean, that might even mean cabinet posts or something.
Well, there's a lot of ambiguity in what was said. And if you take the issues of Trident, of immigration in Europe, there are very fundamental differences. And of course, if you come to the issue of an inquiry into electoral reform, we've been round that course. We were round that course with Labour, with the Jenkins Commission.
So none of it appealed to you at all?
Well, the fact that this offer is made in this form, what is it, open and comprehensive, that is obviously something which will be very carefully considered.
You stick on your toes and you're playing hard to get.
Well, I'm taking him at face value, just as you would expect him to take what the Prime Minister said a little earlier at face value, and to decide whether or not any agreement of any kind foreshadowed by either of them is in the national interest.
For you, you'd need more on electoral reform, would you?
There's no doubt that electoral reform is right at the very heart of the Liberal Democrat view about what is necessary to help to clean up politics. We've been around that course before. We had an inquiry before. What happened to it?
We want a commitment.
It went into a pigeonhole somewhere in the Home Office and never reappeared again. And indeed, it was of such significance that it led to a pretty major falling out between Roy Jenkins and Tony Blair.
So you would want a firm commitment from a Conservative government that it would, at the very least, offer a referendum on electoral reform.
Proportional representation is an important plank in the Liberal Democrats' view of how the country's politics should be reordered to try and recreate a connection between public and politicians. It lies right at the very heart of that, and as the results in the election that's just finished show, and indeed as the attitude of the public throughout the campaign shows, there's increasing support for the importance of proportional representation.
Okay, you've got Jeff Hoon, just retired Labour MP, former Cabinet Minister, and Douglas Carswell, active Conservative MP, sitting on either side of you. Douglas Carswell, could you live with the idea of a referendum on electoral reform?
Speaking personally, yes. Having contributed a number of the ideas that David Cameron has taken up and put in the manifesto on the Great Repeal Bill, on radical localism, I find myself being contacted by Liberal Democrats saying it's their idea all along, so let's work together.
And you can live with all the other ideas that David Cameron outlined?
Well, speaking personally,
yes.
I've changed my mind on electoral reform. 5 years ago, if you had asked me, do we need to change, I would have said no. But 5 years in the House of Commons has convinced me we need to change our electoral system.
Jeff Hoon, when you heard that speech from David Cameron, he looked and he sounded like a real leader, didn't he?
I think all three leaders today have been very, very impressive. They've all set out the principles. What's important now is that they translate those principles into practice.
But when you look at Gordon Brown, here's a man who inherited office. You couldn't get rid of him, other plotters couldn't get rid of him, and now he's lost an election. Does that strike you as a man who's fit to stay in Downing Street?
But I thought his statement encapsulated precisely what the country is looking for. And as I say, the challenge for all three of them is to find a way of translating those admirable statements of principle into practical reality.
OK, chaps, I've got to hand back to David Dimbleby. David.
Jeremy, thank you very much. Well, let's just have a reminder of what the statements that everybody's talking about were, just in brief, a précis of them. David Cameron's, first of all, what he called a comprehensive offer to the Liberal Democrats, set up a committee on electoral reform, repeal Labour's national insurance rise, and no compromise on Europe or defence issues. He made that fairly clear. And the Brown statement, economic recovery is the priority. He said that Clegg and Cameron should have time to discuss the possibility of cooperating together. Legislation was needed to reform the voting system, and people should decide the outcome of that in a referendum. Nobody's being very clear at this stage about what kind of change to the voting system they want. One offers an all-party committee. The other says there'll be a referendum of the people on it.
I just dug out some previous David Cameron quotes on PR, which is quite interesting. You know, asked by Ben Brogan from The Telegraph whether he'd accept a referendum on PR, Cameron says, "We're not proposing a referendum on PR because we don't support PR. It would be rather strange to have a referendum on things you don't support. We don't want PR and we don't want a referendum on PR." But he doesn't actually say, under no circumstances will we. I mean, he doesn't say never in any of the quotes that I can find. Does he like PR? No, he doesn't. Would he prefer to keep first past the post? Yes, he would. But I still think there is an area of ambiguity there from David Cameron which just about leaves the door ajar. But I mean, I'm sure that Nick Clegg's people, and one of their spokesmen has said, very interesting, but we're not going to say any more for the time being about what David Cameron has said. I think they will want to know that a committee of inquiry into this is going to go somewhere and go somewhere quickly.
Would it be acceptable to the Tories, do you think? It doesn't sound as though it would be, to say, we'll offer you, the Liberal Democrats, a referendum on whatever form of proportional representation we come up with, and we know that a lot of the suggestions from Labour are not actually proportional representation, the alternative vote and all that. We'll offer you a referendum, but we reserve the right to urge the country to vote against it. Do you think that would be acceptable?
Well, that may well satisfy them. You're not. I don't think Nick Clegg would say, "I'm sorry, and I'm going to dragoon the Conservative government and ministers into outwardly campaigning for PR." But it may be, if he gets his referendum, he'll be happy with that.
All right, well, David Cameron has described the hung parliament that he's got in the past as muddle and fudge. Muddle and fudge is what has resulted from this election. Muddle and fudge, Andrew. Has resulted from this election.